Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my room. I'm delighted to see you today. It's a Friday video. It's not what I typically do, but as you know, I sometimes, feel excited enough that I have the energy to share a video even after work. Now, this video that I'm going to be, that I'm presenting to you now, is a video where we're going to return to the question of the relationship between MBTI and science. So hopefully there'll be many among you who are interested. Now, before I move to my topic, let me remind you that I have written 2 books in the last year. The Ecstatic Soul reference exploration of the INFJ personality. It's a must-read according to the reviews. So all the links below if you want to get the book on Amazon. And this is my new novel, The Infinite Castle, which is a very nice product if you look at it. And what I like to say in order to sell the book is that the main character is probably an INFJ. If you're into existentialism, if you're into questions of the meaning of love, the meaning of identity, if you're interested in writers like Camus, writers like Murakami, writers like Kafka, I think that you'd find a lot to like in this novel. So thank you for supporting me. Again, all the links are down below. Now, look, there is certainly a sense in which the conversations about MBTI's relationship to science are a little bit tiring. They're a little bit tiring because, well, first of all, because they seem at times like they're not worth putting effort into, in the sense that it's not going to convince people who are not willing to be convinced. And there is a very wide variety of videos these days that, liken MBTI to pseudoscience. And that process itself is tiring because it's a very unoriginal point of view, usually presented in a very unoriginal, kind of tired way and not more convincing than any other account. Now, that being said, it's always interesting to think about the relationship between MBTI and science because, well, there's probably things to learn from it. And if we are, there's 2 possible strategies for taking a stance that we are rejecting these debunkings of MBTI as being pseudoscientific. Now, the 2 strategies are, as I see them, the first strategy is to claim that, that question is not a meaningful question because MBTI is just a vocabulary to describe your self-perceptions. So from this perspective, because I think that reply is actually not a bad one, from this perspective, this is roughly equivalent to saying that that science by definition is aiming at an objective view of reality. There's, nothing that science is if not aiming for something objective, an objective account of how things are. Whereas MBTI, according to this view, aims for a subjective account of reality. Insofar as MBTI aims at a subjective account of personality, an account that resonates with the subject rather than with the objects, aligns with the subjects rather than with the objects, well, it's just not relevant to science. Doesn't mean it's not valid. So this particular approach consists in saying the validity of MBTI does not depend on whether or not it's scientific. It's not meant to be. It's a little bit like, exactly, it's like, you read The Infinite Castle, and maybe this is going to teach you things about your psyche, and nobody would come and say, oh, but that's The Infinite Castle is pseudoscience. I'm not joking about this. There are philosophers such as pragmatist philosophers, Richard Rorty. In fact, the later Wittgenstein probably would have that view. That it's just kind of meaningless to base your valuation of MBTI on the basis of whether or not in science, because it's not relevant. So that's the first approach. But let's assume that there's this other approach that we can take and just say, no, like MBTI is not pseudoscience. It is, maybe it's not scientific in the most of the expressions of it that we come across in YouTube videos, in the literature, including in this book. And this book is not, I wouldn't say it's pseudoscience, but it's more philosophy than science, certainly. But in terms of the potential it has, and the videos, I've made videos to that effect before many times, showing that the possibility that MBTI could be made into a science. Now, that might come at the expense of certain cherished aspects of MBTI conceived in the first sense, the sense in which it's more a literature, a vocabulary to describe the reality of the subjective experience rather than the objective world. If you want to look at the objective side of the coin, obviously you're going to lose part of the vocabulary that makes it so cherished to people. So it doesn't have to be embraced, but it's a worthy, I think, it's a worthy topic to approach. And in the past, I was discussing the criticisms of MBTI as pseudoscience, mostly from the point of view of its, MBTI is not testable and MBTI cannot be falsified. And I showed in those videos, and I'm going to return to it, that it's actually pretty easy if you're smart enough, if you're perspicuous enough to devise systems or devise frameworks whereby you can actually test for, you formulate the MBTI hypotheses and then test for them. And the question would arise whether these tests are reliable and so on, but in principle, there's nothing that's impossible about that. Now, on a Popperian understanding of what science is, that's enough of a criterion to make MBTI in potential qualify as science. But there's another angle of criticism, obviously, and maybe that's the angle that people who are either scientists or people who fancy themselves as being very science savvy criticize MBTI for. And that angle is essentially that it's, if I wanted to use slightly fancy vocabulary, a fancy way of describing it, I would say it's that the ontology of MBTI is very, it's kind of like, fuzzy, magical. It's like we talk about cognitive functions. In some sense, the function stack, the cognitive functions, are the bedrock. They're the main sort of objects of our, with which we articulate our descriptions of what types are. But what are the cognitive functions? That's what the scientist is probably going to dislike. Or someone who criticizes MBTI is to say, what are they? We are always talking about the cognitive functions, but where are they? Are they in the mind? What's the mind? Are they in the brain? These are the typical questions. And if for someone who aims to give MBTI scientific respectability, it's a fair question to ask yourself, okay, where are the cognitive functions? Seems like a very straightforward question, but, scientists would want to know that. If you read Jung, you immediately notice that, Jung does not answer that question. He doesn't answer that question because he sees the cognitive functions, I think, as aspects of the self, as dimensions of the self. You could call them as psychological processes that are part of the bigger frame that is the self. The descriptions, if you like, that Jung provides are psychologistic or mentalistic, and that's fine for non-science. It's going to be an issue with science. So I was thinking that, and this is also these are thoughts that I'm having because of my very fruitful interactions with the cognitive type community, which again I cannot not stop recommending if you're interested in the dimension of turning personality or cognitive processing into a science. This is where you want to go these days online. But I was thinking, what can we use from what we know of relatively recent cognitive science that can point in a direction toward telling us about where the cognitive functions are? And then from this perspective, I'm curious also to know what you guys think. If you consider one of the debates in in psychology, philosophy of psychology, cognitive science these days. It's a debate that's still going on, and it's probably not going to be over for a while, about whether the mind has different faculties. There's that's something that's generally agreed. You have memory, you have various types of reasoning, you have perception, you have all sorts of different kinds of faculties. There's also the decision-making faculty and so on. Now, in the community, in the psychological community, there's a debate, like I said, between those who hold that the faculties are horizontal, those who hold that the faculties are vertical, and those who hold that some are horizontal and some are vertical. Now, I don't want to confuse you too much. So let us just say that if you hold that faculties are horizontal, that's a way of saying that they're not domain specific. Just they have more traits specific to them, but the main aspect of them is that they're not domain specific. In other words, if you were to suppose that there's a faculty that has to do with, let's say there's a faculty of, I'm going to use like an example just here, just to illustrate. So let's say there's a particular faculty of reasoning, and you can have a strongly developed, you can be very, very good at kind of rational reasoning, for example. So people who hold the horizontal view of our faculties, and again, I'm talking about the research community here. I'm not talking about just people on YouTube like myself. They hold that it's the one faculty that's applied across all possible domains. So you have your reasoning capacity is the same whether you apply it to when you're cooking, whether you're reading a book, whether you're driving, whether you're teaching, whether you are engaged in conversation, and regardless of the conversation, right? So it's all these, when you're playing chess, that kind of thing. If you take that view and you apply it to all possible faculties, if they're all horizontal, they apply across the board, not domain specific. The conception of vertical faculties is different, because the conception of vertical faculties holds that if on an extreme version, all faculties are all domain specific. In other words, your rational faculty for cooking is different from your rational faculty for reading, which is different from your rational faculty for teaching, for talking with people, etc. One of the arguments that's offered in favor of the vertical faculty hypothesis as opposed to the horizontal is that, well, very clearly, some people are great at mathematical reasoning, but terrible at literary analysis of texts, or some people are great at driving or great at teaching and they're terrible at chess. Some people are amazing at chess and they're terrible about any possible kind of other reasoning, such as Bobby Fischer, for example. So how do you explain for that? How do you account for that? Well, the faculties must be vertical. Now, it has to be said that it's probably the case that the notion that faculties are horizontal, the horizontal hypothesis is held by the majority of researchers. But there is a minority of researchers who hold to at least a mixed model. And the argument for it being that if you at least divide the mental processes, let's say between two kinds, you can divide them between the input processes and then the central processes, to use Jerry Fodor's definition, cognitive scientist Jerry Fodor's definitions. An input process is how you process information that comes from outside. So in the case, say, of how you process a vision input or an utterance, say, language. The idea would be that these, according to the vertical faculty defenders, that these input processes would actually be vertical because, and therefore domain specific. So we have domain specific faculties for visual processing and also for language processing, because there's a number of reasons, including the sheer speed at which we are able to process this. And also the fact that they seem to be insensitive to actual motivations. So, if you see a patch of red, you cannot decide that you want to see green. If you hear a kind of music, you cannot block that music from sounding the way it does. You cannot, if someone utters a particular sentence, you cannot help but understand it in that particular way. All right, it's something that you have no influence over, and it's extremely fast. In some sense, it's a dumb process, but it's a very fast process. So there are reasons to think that it is self-contained and vertical in this sense. The essential processes, though, processes where we're using our reasoning, where we're using our memory, where we're using, anything that requires, if you like, a process of inference, making inferences to get to from a point A to a point B to a point C, they take longer. And there seems to be more evidence that these are so-called central processes. Central processes are horizontal. Okay, now, someone like Chomsky, who's not exactly, a newcomer to the field, I've heard him mention in a lot of conferences that he thinks that even among the central processes, there is no way to account for a bunch of characteristics of the way that we use language and what our language looks like. There's no way that at least some of even the central faculties are not vertical. Maybe not all of them. Okay, granted, there are probably some horizontal faculties, but some of them must be vertical. So how is this all relevant to MBTI in relationship to science? Well, here comes the main point. It seems tempting to think that on that particular interpretation, we can take a mixed model of some horizontal faculties and some vertical faculties. And if you allow for a more Chomskyan perspective, where even some central process faculties are vertical, well, maybe the cognitive functions are just among those vertical processes. We would have, each according to our, genetic code, let's say in this case, it would have to be hardwired in the brain, so it would have to be genetic, at least to a great extent. We would have certain processes that are domain-specific. Now, what characterizes a domain-specific process, a vertical process, is that it has an independent, autonomous programming code, if you like. And there's nothing to prevent us from thinking that there are such programming codes inside cognitive processes that correspond to FE, correspond to FI, correspond to TI, correspond to NE, correspond to NI, and so on. And that for some reason, among us, some people have activated vertical processes for certain functions, and either not for others, or to a very much lesser extent for others. I think that would be a way of connecting the cognitive functions to something that's starting to resemble the ontology of a science, by connecting the cognitive functions to what psychological science defines as the vertical faculties, the vertical processes, or you might also call them modular processes, to use Jerry Fodor's terminology. Although again, on Fodor's interpretation, that probably would be inaccurate because he rejects the idea that central processes are vertical. But Chomsky might be our way to solve this riddle. But again, I just wanted to offer you some pathways to thinking about this topic and to share with me in the comments. And I'm just starting to think about this myself. And I think that ultimately what will be cutting edge, in this domain, again, for those who are interested in having a scientific and as materialistic as possible, non-reductive materialistic interpretation of types, the way to go, the cutting edge, will be cognitive typology. Doesn't prevent us from having a chat here and connecting it more broadly to MBTI. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys, and I will see you on Sunday. Ciao, ciao.